Imagine that you had to swap bodies with a random person. Your memory and conscious experiences remain the same, so you would most certainly perceive yourself as who you used to be. Meanwhile, it won't be obvious for most people around you that your body is currently occupied by a stranger. Even the people close to you probably won't notice immediately. So does the mind constitute person's identity? Or is it the body, or something else? In this video, we'll look into John Locke's theory of identity and consider a possible challenge to his ideas. What do we usually mean when we say that the thing is identical to itself? It is not as simple as it looks at first sight. What comes to mind is a sense of continuity. For example, an oak would remain identical to itself as long as it functions as an oak, receives and produces nourishment, grows branches, replenishes bark, etc. The atoms that constitute the oak will change, but its identity remains the same as long as it stays alive. The same principle seems to apply to animals. We would say that a bear is the same bear as long as it is continuous in its animal functions since a certain point in the past when it was born. We can suppose that the same type of continuity would characterize human beings. But humans are different. Unlike animals, humans are capable of rational thought. Therefore, it would be incoherent to define their identity as strictly according to their biological functions. This is precisely the point Locke makes. In his view, our identity is primarily dependent on our memories and self-awareness. Nothing but consciousness can unite remote existences into the same person. But what does he mean by that? Will any memory work for our identity? Imagine that you suffered a temporary loss of memory due to head injury or an altered state of consciousness. In this state, you cannot recall your real name, your past experiences, or anything about your actual life. However, you vividly remember watching a documentary about Napoleon, and in this moment, that memory feels like your own. Believing yourself to be the French emperor, you confidently introduce yourself as Bonaparte. Would it account for an identity change? People around you, of course, recognize that you are mistaken. They see you as the same individual you were before, despite of your current confusion. Yet, according to Locke, identity is not determined by the external perception or the continuity of your physical body. It is rather, as we said before, tied to memory and self-awareness. Though here there is a subtle distinction. If your consciousness truly contained the lived experiences of Napoleon in a continuous way, then, in Locke's view, you would be Napoleon, regardless of the body you inhabit. However, because your memory of Napoleon is merely an isolated thought, rather than a sustained recollection of his life from childhood to exile, it does not establish a genuine identity shift. So in such case, you are not in fact Napoleon. But what if we go further? What if someone actually did wake up one day with a full set of memories that belonged to another person? If you were to remember every detail of someone else's life as if you had lived it, wouldn't you, in a very real sense, be that other person? This is exactly the question Locke explores in his famous thought experiment about the prince and the cobbler. He asks us to imagine that one morning the mind of a prince, with all his memories, thoughts, and character, suddenly finds itself in the body of a cobbler. The cobbler, meanwhile, has lost all recollection of his previous life. Now this cobbler behaves exactly like a prince, recalling royal events, recognizing the prince's family, and thinking of himself as a nobleman rather than a simple shoemaker. Would it make sense to still call him the cobbler? Locke argues that we should not. Since the prince's memories continue, his identity stays the same, despite his physical change. Locke presents two more thought experiments to illustrate his point. First, imagine a person whose consciousness completely changes between day and night, with no memory connecting these two states. In this case, Locke would argue that these are effectively two different persons inhabiting the same body. Conversely, if two different bodies shared the same continuous consciousness and memories, they would, in Locke's view, be the same person, despite having separate physical forms. Locke's psychological theory of identity seems to be convincing. Indeed, in various scenarios that we can imagine, it seems that the continuity of our minds is what primarily constitutes our identity. However, in this framework, our bodies seem to be entirely neglected. Are they, after all, completely unimportant in defining our identity? To explore this question, let's turn to a contemporary philosopher, Bernard Williams, who in his article The Self and the Future suggests a series of peculiar thought experiments, one of which shows a tension between the psychological and bodily views on human identity. Imagine that you and another person are told that your minds will be swapped. Your consciousness, memories, and personality will move into their body, and theirs respectively into yours. Additionally, you're informed that after the procedure, one of you will receive a $100,000 award, while the other one will be tortured. Faced with this choice, what would you prefer? If you truly believe Locke's theory that identity follows memory and consciousness, it would be wise to wish that the person standing in front of you receives the money, because after the swap you will be in their body, experiencing life from their perspective. You would not be concerned about what happens to your body, because in Locke's terms, it won't be you. So acting out of self-interest, it is wise to have such expectations. This first experiment is therefore in favor of Locke's psychological view on human identity. We seem to be more interested in prize that our conscious self is getting, and therefore it is not hard to make our decision in such case. Here our self-interest aligns with the mind, not the body. Now consider a different scenario. You are told that your body will be subjected to torture. However, before the procedure, every trace of your memories, personality, and consciousness will be erased and replaced with those of another person. The new consciousness will have no recollection of your life, no connection to your past, and no sense of being you. Basically, this situation should be similar to the first one. If personal identity is defined by memories, as Locke argues, then after the procedure, the person experiencing pain will not be you. It will be someone else entirely, someone who has no awareness that they ever were different. In theory, you should be indifferent to the fate of your body. After all, the version of you that exists right now will have ceased to be. And yet, despite this reasoning, most people instinctively fear this scenario. The idea of your body being tortured, even if your mind will be erased beforehand, still provokes anxiety and dread. There is a powerful sense that even if your conscious self is gone, something still remains tied to the body, something that will experience pain. This reveals an interesting philosophical tension. Why is it easier to accept that we will continue in another body when our mind is transferred, yet so much harder to accept that we will cease to exist when our mind is erased from our own body? If personal identity is purely psychological, why do we still feel attached to what happens to our physical form, even when our consciousness is removed? This suggests that we might not be as detached from our bodily existence as Locke's theory implies. While memory and self-awareness are crucial to identity, our connection to our own flesh and blood seems to run deeper than mere psychological continuity. Even if our mind is altered, there is an intuitive feeling that our body still in some way remains ours. Williams' thought experiments expose a contradiction in how we think about personal identity. While we seem to accept that our consciousness determines who we are, we instinctively fear bodily suffering even when our psychological self is absent. This suggests that our identity is not as purely mental as Locke claimed. Our embodiment plays a role in how we perceive ourselves. In the end, Williams does not entirely reject the psychological view of identity, but shows that it is incomplete. Our attachment to our bodies is stronger than Locke's theory accounts for, and our self-conception might be more deeply rooted in our physical form than we like to admit. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, like it and subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next videos about philosophy.